Ever wish you had like a cheat sheet for understanding all those rules and regulations that keep our world, running smoothly?
Yeah.
Especially when those rules involve really complex professions.
Right.
Like today we're diving into the world of engineering and geoscience in British Columbia.
Yeah, it's a fascinating world for
Yeah.
sure. And the stakes are high,
Yeah.
right? I mean, we're talking about, the very foundations of our buildings
Oh,
and
absolutely.
bridges and the resources we depend on.
It's serious business.
Yeah.
So that's where we get into, the subject of today's deep dive. We're talking about professional ethics.
Exactly.
And specifically in British Columbia, for engineers and geoscientists, we have Engineers and Geoscientists BC.
Right.
EGBC.
EGBC. Yeah, they're the governing body, making sure that all those brilliant minds out there, the ones building our future, are playing by the rules.
It's like having referees, right?
Yeah.
You got to have referees in the game so they're safeguarding the public interest.
And it goes beyond just preventing disasters.
Yeah.
Right? It's about trust.
Okay.
Cultivating trust.
Yeah.
Which impacts everyone.
So how do they actually DO that? How do they create this environment of trust and safety?
Well, they've given us two really crucial documents.
Okay.
The Code of Ethics and the Bylaws.
Okay.
You could almost think of the Code of Ethics as the moral compass
Right?
guiding every professional decision.
Okay.
And then the bylaws are more like the detailed roadmap. They lay down those specific rules of the road.
I like the compass and the roadmap. So the Code of Ethics is that big picture.
Absolutely. It's the foundation.
Yeah.
The ethical foundation.
Okay.
And it all boils down to 13 principles. But the first one looms. Large public safety.
Okay.
That's paramount. And when I say paramount, I don't just mean top priority. It's the priority, above all else.
So no cutting corners, even if you're just trying to, meet a deadline.
No,
Yeah.
no way. And, I mean, there's a chilling story. This was in the U.S. about a bridge collapse. An engineer, they basically dismissed this critical calculation. They thought it was insignificant. And that bridge collapse, tragically, led to loss of life.
Oh.
So that principle, public safety being paramount, it's not just a suggestion. Lives depend on it.
Yeah, that really drives home the importance of that first principle. What other principles, really jumped out at you when you were looking at this Code of Ethics?
Well, competence is key.
Right.
That's principle 2.
Yeah.
It underscores that professionals, they have to practice only within their area of expertise. I mean, you wouldn't want a mining engineer, right?
Designing the skyscraper.
Exactly.
Yeah,
Talk about a recipe for disaster.
that sounds like a problem.
Big time. Just imagine those consequences. Someone practicing beyond their expertise. The code makes it clear if you don't have the knowledge or experience for a specific task, you don't take that risk.
Yeah, that makes sense. You got to stick to your lane professionally. So any other principles that, kind of stood out to you when you were reading through all this?
Yeah, for sure. Principles 6 and 7, dealing with accountability and transparency. Those were really interesting to me.
Okay.
They really highlight, just how important clear communication is.
Right.
Especially, when we're talking about qualifications and distinguishing between facts and opinions.
Okay.
You really want to be sure that the professional you're working with, they're being upfront about what they actually know.
Right.
And what they might just be, speculating on.
So they're not afraid to say, hey, that's a little bit outside my area of expertise.
Exactly. They're not pretending to have all the answers when they don't.
Right.
Speaking of honesty, Principle 8, that gets into conflicts of interest.
Oh, yeah. Conflicts of interest. That's
a big one.
A big one. And it seems to come up in pretty much every profession, right?
It does. And EGBC, they take it seriously. Like the code, it doesn't just say avoid conflicts.
Right.
It says you have to disclose any potential ones as well. And that transparency, that's essential for, keeping that public trust, right?
Yeah. Sunlight's the best disinfectant, as they say.
Exactly.
Speaking of which, we've got Principle 9, all about whistleblowing.
Right. And that one really drives home the responsibility these folks have.
Oh.
Engineers and geoscientists, they have a responsibility to report, on unethical or harmful practices.
Yeah.
Anything they encounter, even if it means, they got to speak up against a colleague or even their employer.
Yeah, that takes guts to do that.
It does. But it's crucial. Right? It protects the public, and it also protects the integrity of the entire profession.
Right.
And, all of these principles, they're tied together by this overarching idea of professionalism.
Right.
That's Principle 13.
Right.
And really, it just boils down to treating everyone with respect, right? Clients, colleagues, the public, fairness. That's paramount.
It's like my old basketball coach used to say, talent wins games, but teamwork and respect, that's how you win championships. Love it.
So we've talked about this ethical foundation, the
Right.
code of ethics, but how does that actually play out in the real world? What can you tell us about these EGBC bylaws?
So the bylaws, this is where the rubber meets the road,
Okay.
right? This is where those ethical principles, they get translated into, actual rules and procedures. For engineering and geoscience here in BC, you can almost think of it as the really comprehensive guidebook for anyone navigating the ins and outs of these professions.
Okay, so let's open this guidebook up. Let's flip through a couple of pages. First up, registration.
Okay.
What do you actually need to, like, legally work as an engineer or geoscientist in BC?
Right. So you can't just, hang up a shingle that says engineer for hire.
Right.
Right. It's a little more involved than that. First
Yeah.
and foremost, you've got to be registered with EGBC.
Okay.
And there are different categories for registration, too.
Okay.
Each one has its own requirements, its own authorizations.
So it's not one size fits all. Not at all. No, no. For example, you have professional engineers, you have professional geoscientists.
Right.
Those are like the fully licensed practitioners in their fields.
Right.
But then you've also got categories, for more specialized roles, like you've got professional licensees.
Okay.
Those are people who might focus on really specific areas
Yeah.
within engineering or geoscience. And they even have categories for people who've retired.
Yeah.
Or maybe they're not practicing anymore, but they still want to, keep that connection to their profession.
Right. Right.
So it's pretty comprehensive.
It sounds like they've thought of everything.
They really have.
Okay, so let's say you are a qualified engineer, you've got your, your registration sorted. Is there like a license to practice kind of thing?
You're spot on.
Okay.
Yeah, it's called a permit to practice.
Okay.
And it's really important. And it's not just for individual professionals either. Any firm, any company doing engineering or geoscience work here in BC,
Right.
they have to be registered with EGBC.
Well,
And they need to hold a valid permit to practice.
so it's not just about individual accountability, it's about holding those companies to the same standard as well.
Exactly. It's about making sure those entire companies, they're operating within that established framework. There's no cutting corners.
Right. That's a strong message.
It is.
Yeah.
It really is. EGBC is making it clear that, professional accountability is not just an individual thing.
Right.
It goes all the way up to the top. And that's really essential if you're going to maintain, consistent standards
Right.
and if you want to protect the public.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. Now, we all know fields like engineering and geoscience, they're constantly evolving, right?
Absolutely.
So how do these professionals, how do they stay up to date? How do they make sure that they are at the, the cutting edge of their field?
That's where continuing education comes in.
Okay.
EGBC, they mandate that every single registered professional
Right.
engages in ongoing learning.
So you can't just, get your degree and then just rest on your laurels.
Nope, not in these fields. You can't just coast.
Okay.
The bylaws are very clear.
Yep.
You have to stay current.
Yeah.
Latest advancements, the technologies, best practices, that's non-negotiable if you're a professional in BC.
Yeah, it'd be like, imagine if a doctor was using like outdated medical practices.
Right,
It's
exactly.
the same. It's got to be the same for engineering and geoscience. What happens if somebody, kind of just decides to ignore those continuing education requirements?
Well, there are consequences, potentially serious ones.
Okay.
I mean, you could get your license suspended.
Right.
Or even revoked entirely.
Mm.
EGBC, they have a duty to make sure that only people who are competent, right?
Right.
Only those people are allowed to work on projects that are going to impact public safety, well-being. It's not just, a box to check off on a form.
Right.
It's about maintaining the high standards of those professions.
Okay, so we've talked about registration, continuing education. What about the actual work itself? What do the bylaws have to say about, quality management? Like, how do we know that the work being done is actually up to par?
Oh, it's huge.
Mm.
Quality management it's a big part of those bylaws.
Yeah.
One of the key things is documentation.
Okay.
Professionals, they have to really carefully document everything, like how they're adhering to those professional practice guidelines,
Right.
and if they need to deviate for any reason,
Yeah.
well, they've got to clearly justify it.
So there's a record of it. It's transparent. It's accountable.
Exactly. And that's not all. The bylaws also talk about these,
Uh,
regular checks and balances.
okay.
So like professionals, they're required to have their work reviewed
Oh, okay.
by a qualified colleague.
It's like a second
And
pair of eyes, right?
yeah, two heads are better than one.
Yeah.
Especially when you're talking about, really complex engineering analysis or,
Absolutely.
geological stuff, for sure. And when you get into projects that are considered high risk, like think about designing a bridge
Right?
or a dam, something like that, the bylaws, they say you have to have an independent review,
Oh, wow.
someone who had nothing to do with the original work.
It was like a totally fresh perspective.
Totally fresh. And that just adds another layer of scrutiny.
Right.
It helps ensure that every single critical aspect of that project, it's been evaluated thoroughly.
Yeah, it's like having an independent audit almost.
Exactly.
Yeah.
You want to make sure everything's up to par.
Right, right. Now, we can't talk about professional regulations without talking about what happens if something goes wrong.
Right.
Right. If there's a complaint
Of course.
about a professional's conduct, what do the bylaws say about that?
Well, that's where you really see EGBC's commitment to this idea of accountability.
Okay.
They have a very clear process for dealing with complaints against registrants.
Okay.
So if someone raises a concern, EGBC, they have to investigate it thoroughly.
And what happens if, they find out that a professional, maybe they did act unethically?
Right? Or they violated the code of conduct. What happens then? Well, EGBC, they can do a few things. They have the power to impose disciplinary action.
Okay.
And that could be anything from, just a formal reprimand
Right.
all the way up to suspension or even revoking their license altogether.
Oh, wow.
It really depends on, what happened,
Right.
how serious was it, that kind of thing.
So the punishment, so to speak, fits the crime.
Exactly.
Mm.
EGBC has to protect the public, and that means holding people accountable for their actions. And it's worth pointing out, EGBC, they're really committed to transparency through this entire process.
Okay, that's good.
So obviously they maintain confidentiality,
Right.
to protect the people involved,
Of course, yeah.
but they also make their disciplinary decisions public.
Wow, okay.
They publish them. And that lets potential clients, it lets the public see, okay, these complaints, they're taken seriously.
Yep.
And if something's wrong, they're going to take action.
That's really good to know. So we've covered a lot of ground here. We've talked about this ethical compass.
Yeah.
We've talked about this detailed roadmap of the bylaws.
That's right.
We've even gotten into the nitty-gritty of, how they actually hold people accountable.
Accountability is key.
So for our listener at home, right?
Yeah.
Maybe they're not an engineer, they're not a geoscientist,
Right.
but they still rely on the work of these professions every single day.
Every day, yeah.
What does all of this mean for them?
That is the question, isn't it? It's important for everyone to understand these guidelines, to understand how EGBC operates.
Okay.
I mean, whether you're, hiring an engineer, you're having some work done on your house, maybe you're driving across a bridge.
Right. Or you're just living in a world that's been shaped by
Exactly.
defects.
It affects all of us.
It does, yeah. So it's about having confidence.
Right. It's about trust.
Yeah.
Knowing that these professionals, they're held to a high standard
Right.
and that there are safeguards in place to protect you.
It's almost like having that behind the scenes look, at how these professions work,
It is.
what standards they're held to, how they make sure that, the public is protected.
And that's what it's all about at
Well,
the end of the day.
Fostering that trust, that transparency. It's a safer world for everyone.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Yeah.
And it all starts with asking questions,
Yeah.
understanding what your rights are,
Right.
and holding these professionals accountable.
Absolutely. Now, before we go, I want to leave you with something to think about.
Okay.
As technology keeps advancing, right? I mean, it's moving faster than ever.
Oh, for sure.
And the challenges that these professions are facing, they're just getting more and more complex every day, right?
Every day.
How do we make sure that those ethical considerations, they don't get lost in the shuffle?
That's the question.
That's something to think about. As
Yeah.
you go about your day, you're interacting with the built environment, the natural world,
Yeah.
all of that. That's something to ponder.
Big questions.
Big questions, no easy answers. But hey, that's why we're here, right? To have these discussions. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive, everybody.